my name is Ryan New. I'm the instructional lead of social studies at Jefferson County Public Schools. Today we're going to be looking at how do I gather, select, and adapt sources. Let's contextualize what we've been talking about of why sources are so important when it comes to inquiry and our democracy. This brings us to a principal advantage of inquiry. It gives us something to talk about. The kind of pluralistic democracy we envision depends on deliberation among equals in pursuit of shared knowledge and understanding. Without inquiry, this kind of communication is unlikely to take place, but the sources of knowledge and belief are either hidden or unquestioned. However, inquiry makes the process of knowledge construction more transparent. By laying out questions, evidence, and conclusions in clear view, inquiry allows ideas to be challenged without attacking anyone's identity or belief system. One of the most problematic things about inquiry are its sources. They're hard to find, and they're problematic to teach in class. It's hard for students to read them, and of all the things that we could do as teachers, having a wrong source or a misrepresented source is one of the things that we all sort of fear. We'll do our best to cultivate these together, but ultimately you should know that you are the curricular gatekeeper of your classroom. And it's whatever you decide to move into, it's trying to figure out how to move safely in and safely out of some of the sources. We as social studies teachers talk about the entirety of human experience, past and present. And a lot of this past and present is filled with nastiness. How do we then expose and how do we look at this? Inquiry provides an opportunity to separate the ideas of the teacher from what's being discussed. We can help discuss something that's quite nasty and terrible with our students. But if we were teaching it in that same way, it might be difficult for students to separate our understanding from what the teaching actually is. So inquiry is a way that can protect our craft. Sources are also a big part of the cluster sets and the stimuli that we're going to be having our students prepared to respond to on the state assessment. We've been talking a lot about how the essential elements of inquiry are questions, sources, and task, and how sources are really the linchpin of inquiry. Without sources, questions cannot be answered. Task cannot be completed. It is really the sources that provide the greatest impetus to try to use them to answer questions, to complete tasks, and even have discussions. Sources are where it's at. How might inquiry look like in a typical class? We've seen this slide before. We're looking at how the beginning of class, you're engaging maybe in sources, that in the middle of class, you're reading these sources and talking about them, organizing their ideas, ultimately so that you can use those sources to create an argument. Remember, an argument, or even a claim, is a collection of understandings based upon evidence. Without evidence, we do not have claims, we do not have arguments. So primary and secondary sources then help provide us with a foundation, a commonplace, something to talk about. And remember, we've talked a lot about how really anything that can be studied or analyzed, whether human or natural, can be a source. I used to be very jealous, for example, of science, who has phenomena. And you would have phenomenon like a rainbow, and you would see it, and you'd be like, how does this work? And then you come into the science class, and you talk about the physical environment. You're making sense of the physical world. Sources for us are the same thing. They're helping make sense of the past and present. They're helping make sense of the social world. So then we must be very judicious with our selection of the different types and how they align to questions and tasks. We have to make sure that we are culturally responsive in our judicious selection. And then ultimately, the textbooks have a problem. Textbooks are actually a tertiary source. They're a third source, and oftentimes command too much of the learning inside of a classroom. They are built to be as vanilla and plain as possible in order to sell to the largest audience. So essentially then we're exposing our students not to anything that's rich or meaningful, but to what is the least controversial. That's why textbooks are so problem in social studies. Everything we talk about is controversial. What are some examples of sources? Here, I've just tried to collect a variety of things that you may or may not consider to be a source. Most folks go to something like the Declaration of Independence or to a news article. Some might be looking at maybe artifacts or even types of maps. Maybe even street signs, like the 9th Street Divide in Louisville. There's a lot of symbolism because people have put that symbolism into it, right? Everything down to a kids show or maybe a podcast. Even looking at types of mounds and building structures, to secondary sources, to even urinals. Why urinal? Some of you guys have maybe heard me say this. My son and I were literally at the Yum Center a couple years ago looking at a show, and basically he had to go to the restroom, and he was using one of the lower urinals. As he's taking care of his business, I was making sure that he wasn't going to claim his territory, and I started wondering why this lower urinal exists. And I wondered if it had anything to do with the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I went home and I looked it up, and sure enough, urinals can't be more than 17 inches off the ground so that they can provide greater equity, specifically to men in wheelchairs and persons of small stature. What better source than looking at what's going on and trying to create equity than the bathroom that's down the hall? The reason I bring this up is to show you guys the variety of sources that exist in the world and how we want our students to engage in the sources. Everything that ever is has some history to it, some understanding, a bias. It has power or not power, and we're trying to imagine how to deal with these kinds of realities for our students. So being able to pull them in allows students to better see the sources around and to be questioning and making sense of their social world in the same way that phenomenon helps make sense of the physical. There's a lot of places to go for sources. We will constantly be building and updating. So if you know of a good website that would have primary and secondary sources that have open record, that's what we're really looking for so that we can put it onto the framework. When it comes to how do I select my sources, I talk a lot about to teachers about world building. The types of sources you select lay the foundation for how students engage the questions. Without different types, perspectives, and complexity, students are left with a simplistic view of a very complicated world. Source sets then build and make the past and present real for students. So think about this in the way of a sitcom. If you're looking at The Cosby Show or Roseanne or Home Improvement or Married with Children, which tells you a lot about my childhood, then you can sort of see that most of what happens takes place inside the actual house. If you look at other shows like Breaking Bad or Game of Thrones or The Sopranos, suddenly the world is a much larger place. The same thing is true when it comes to the source selects that teachers are curating. If there's only an exchange by a few, diary entries between women talking about the right to vote, may seem like a very small issue. But let's say that we have perspectives of Black women who were denied the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. And you've got women from Maine to Wyoming talking about this. And you've got an amendment, and you've got court cases about this, and state documents, and maps that are sort of showing what's going on and what newspapers are talking about. Suddenly it seems like this is a very big issue and also a complicated one. That's exactly the kind of world building that we want to do for our students, to show them how the past truly comes alive with the lived experiences and the multiple perspectives that individuals had. So these are a few questions when considering the types of perspectives that you might want to look at. Whenever you're trying to figure out what type of source that you might find for students. And really the big one is dealing with the complexity and how to make those complex sources much more accessible. A reminder that all of our sources that have ever been or ever will be were never designed to teach children. They are just the reactions of other people to the world around them. It's therefore our job not to make the complex simple, but to make the complex accessible. And we can do that in a couple different ways. Remember that sources are essentially anything that can be studied or analyzed. Sources spark curiosity, they need to deliver content, they can support arguments, and they build a world for students to investigate. Without sources, students cannot answer supporting or compelling questions with fidelity. Sources should be adapted then for student use. You can do that in three major ways, and we can help you do that with some of your sources. We've a good teacher that we've worked with, Kelly O'Reilly. Rebecca and I sat down and we helped her modify some Supreme Court cases for one of the classes that she was teaching. That's something that we can help do. So let's take a look then at examples of excerpting, annotating, and modifying. So here's the Declaration of Independence, well known to all. This actually comes from a 5th grade. Just so you know, the lexile level of the Declaration of Independence is actually at a higher level than the Communist Manifesto. We would never give the Communist Manifesto to the kids to read by themselves, but we do this to 10-year-olds all the time with the Declaration. So an excerpt helps sort of chunk things down and make it much more accessible for students to be able to access it. But let's say that we need a bit more. Here's an annotation that allows students to get a better view of what's happening in the source. An annotation can give a background, it can give context, or in the case here, it really sort of helps students see what are the major ideas that the Declaration is really doing. Another great teacher that we've worked with, Joel Dries, talks about how sometimes his students in middle school will actually use the annotation as part of their argumentation. And of course, we want to avoid that, but it really shows you that students are really depending upon those annotations to better really understand that source. And ultimately, because this source is so complicated, I rewrote this for my daughter whenever we were going over a lesson like this, but I kept in certain terminologies, making internal parentheticals so that we don't lose the power of some of these words, specifically these ones because they appear in the standards, but so that it's much more accessible to my daughter, so that she gets to associate this academic vocabulary with words that she uses all the time. Anytime that we modify the actual language of the source, we will always put modified at the very top in the source with a link to the original. But sources by themselves are not evidence. Evidence only exists whenever analysis is put into a source. As an example, the Declaration is a source. It could be evidence of how, in a Lockean understanding, of a social contract and the role between the people and the government. We could use the same source and use it by Elizabeth Cady Stanton or David Walker, who used it to talk about some of the hypocrisy in the development of early America. The source does not change, but the analysis, the direction, the questions that we ask are reshaping that source into new types of evidence. And sometimes that evidence is better than others. That's part of what we do, and part of what we're training our students to be able to do is to weigh and compare evidence. Because in a world without evidence, we get chaos, a place where those who yell the loudest or have the most power win the day. Evidence is the great equalizer. Evidence helps establish facts and avoid a lazy drift of personal opinion. It's the answer to a question, the solution to a problem. We want to live in a world based upon evidence and not just through sources. So as you can see then that the using evidence side with sources is so paramount, and by removing that, we're actually separating the capacity for questions and the disciplines from reaching the arguments and action that we're hoping students to take. But the reality about sources is that they're really hard, and I make no bones about it. And we can support your efforts in a lot of ways, and in making sure that your students or your administrators or your parents and community know how hard it is to find and cultivate sources in social studies. When it comes to budgeting time, that's both budgeting time and you helping find sources, although we've got a lot of teachers who are already collecting some that we can connect you to, but also budgeting time in class. How long does it take to read a source and to process it? When it comes to researching online, Sam Weinberg has done a lot of research around this. When it comes to lateral reading, we're going to do some follow-up videos about that. Building stamina. One of another great teachers that we worked with, Brandon Riddle, talks a lot about how his students were really into sources until they got tired of them, because it's really hard, which means then that if he's a high school teacher, then those students have not really had the stamina to have to read about 1,000 words, which is what he was having them do in his classroom each day. We need to help students build that stamina, as well as building our own stamina to try to find those sources. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is teach kids disciplinary literacy, how to read, how to write, how to speak, how to listen in our disciplines is what makes social studies so unique. Otherwise, we would be a different discipline. But what is it that historians and geographers and economists and political scientists do? They read and they write. This has been about how to gather, select, and adapt sources. Thank you.